I've been a substitute teacher for 9 years, and in that time, I've worked in a lot of schools that felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. That's not unusual. Schools carry history. They hold the weight of everyone who's passed through them, and sometimes that weight settles into the walls and the floors, and you feel it when you walk in on a Monday morning. It doesn't mean anything. It's just the particular texture of old institutional buildings. Harwick Middle School was different. I want to be careful here, because I've told this story before, and people always want to jump ahead to the part where something happens. But I think the most important thing about what happened at Harwick is the part before it. The part where I noticed things and explained them away. The part where I was wrong about being wrong. So let me start at the beginning. I got the call from the district sub-coordinator at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. 8th grade science, Harwick Middle School, the regular teacher out sick. Could I be there by 7:45? I said yes. I'd worked Harwick twice before, both times without incident, and I knew the building well enough to navigate it without a map. I arrived at 7:40, signed in at the front office, got my visitor badge and classroom key, and the subfolder the regular teacher had left. Room 118. First floor, east wing. I'd been in that hallway before, but not that specific room. I found it without trouble, unlocked it, went in. The classroom was standard middle school science. Lab tables in rows, stools instead of chairs, periodic table poster on the front wall, model skeleton in the corner wearing a Santa hat that someone had presumably put on it last December and never taken off. The kind of accumulated detail that makes a room feel lived in and human. I put down my bag and opened the subfolder. Inside was the lesson plan, the seating chart, the class roster, and a single handwritten note from the regular teacher, a Mr. Aldous. The note said, "7th period is 7th period, they know what to do. There's an attendance sheet on the desk. Please take attendance carefully. Underline any name you can't account for." I read the note twice. The instruction to take attendance was standard. The instruction to underline names I couldn't account for was not. Teachers don't usually specify what to do with absences. They have standard procedures. A handwritten note telling me to mark something specific suggested that something specific had happened before. I set the note aside and looked at the seating chart. 7th period had 22 students. The first 6 periods went without incident. I'm going to say that clearly because the structure of this kind of story usually implies that everything was wrong from the start, and it wasn't. The first 6 periods were ordinary. Ordinary in the way that middle school is ordinary, which is to say loud and occasionally chaotic and full of the particular energy of children who have been in a building for 6 hours and have approximately 40 minutes left before they can leave it. I ran the lesson plans, managed the noise, answered questions. Standard sub-day. 7th period was the last class of the day. 3:15 to 4 o'clock. I had the roster in front of me and the attendance sheet and a pen. The students came in the way 7th period students always come in at the end of the day. Loud, loosely organized, taking slightly longer to settle than any earlier class, because they know the end is close and the motivation to behave has largely evaporated. I stood at the front and waited for them to find their seats. I counted as they sat down. 22 on the roster. I counted 19 students in the room. 3 absent was not unusual. I picked up the attendance sheet and went down the roster alphabetically, checking names against faces and the seating chart. The first 18 names I accounted for without trouble. Then I hit the 19th, Callum Eves. His seat, according to the chart, was 2nd row, 3rd from the left. The seat was occupied by a boy who was looking at the board with the particular posture of someone trying to appear attentive. I said his name. He looked up. I checked him off. The 20th name was Owen Marsh. His seat was 4th row, second from the left. I looked at the seat. It was empty. I looked at the next seat over, wondering if he'd moved. Sometimes students shift one seat in a sub-day, testing whether the sub knows the seating chart well enough to notice. I'd been testing this all day, but the seats immediately adjacent to Owen Marsh's assigned position were occupied by students whose names I'd already checked off. I marked Owen Marsh absent and moved on. The 21st name, Priya Solano. Her seat was 1st row, far right. I looked at the seat, also empty. And the 22nd, Theo Wainwright. 3rd row, center. I looked at the seat. Theo Wainwright's seat was not empty. There was a boy sitting in it. He was looking at me. I want to describe what I saw as precisely as I can, because this is the part where I am most aware of the way memory does things to experience. I was standing at the front of a middle school classroom at 3:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October. There were fluorescent lights overhead. The windows on the east wall let in the afternoon sun. I was not in a dark or ambiguous setting. I was in a brightly lit room full of children. The boy in Theo Wainwright's seat looked like an 8th grader. Average height for the age, dark hair, wearing a grey t-shirt. He was sitting the way students sit when they've been told to pay attention, straight, hands on the table, eyes on the teacher. His eyes were on me. What was wrong was not what he looked like. What was wrong was the quality of his attention. I've been teaching or substituting, which is its own specific skill, for 9 years. I know what a middle schooler's attention looks like. Even when they are trying, it has a quality of drift to it. Their eyes move. They process the teacher as one element among many rather than as the singular focus of the room. Even the most engaged students in a late Friday afternoon class are watching the clock, tracking their neighbor, maintaining at least a peripheral awareness of everything around them. This boy was not doing any of that. He was watching me with the complete, unmoving attention of someone who had been waiting for me specifically. Not the way a student waits for a teacher. The way something waits for someone it has been tracking. I said, "Can you tell me your name?" He said nothing. I said it again. The room, which had been at the usual low hum of pre-lesson restlessness, went quiet. Not because I'd asked a question, because the other students had noticed the exchange. I could see it in my peripheral vision, heads turning, the subtle recalibration of a group that has sensed something is off. The boy continued to watch me. He didn't blink. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that during the approximately 12 seconds I stood there looking at him, I did not see him blink. I wrote Theo Wainwright's name on the attendance sheet, in the absent column. Then I drew a line under it, the way Mr. Aldous' note had told me to. I looked up. The seat was empty. I stood very still and looked at the empty seat. Around me, the room remained quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a group of people has seen something they don't have a word for. I said, "Okay, everyone. Let's get started." I got through the class. I don't fully remember how. I ran the lesson plan, which was a chapter review on cell biology, and I called on students and managed the discussion and watched the clock and did not look at Theo Wainwright's seat again for 43 minutes. When the bell rang, the students left the way students leave at the end of the day, fast, with the specific energy of people released from a constraint. In 90 seconds, the room was empty. I stood at the front for a moment. Then I walked to the fourth row, third seat from the left, and stood next to the desk where the boy had been sitting. The desk surface was clean. There was nothing on it, no pencil marks, no scratches, none of the accumulated graffiti that covers most middle school desks after a few years of use. Every other desk in the room had names carved into them, equations, drawings, the layered record of hundreds of students who'd sat there and left some mark. This desk was smooth. I put my hand flat on the surface. It was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Not the slight coolness of a surface that hasn't been warmed by a body in a while. Colder than that. The specific cold of something that has been cold for a long time. I picked up the subfolder and the attendance sheet and my bag, and I went to the front office. The front office secretary was a woman named Mrs. Farrow, who had the manner of someone who had seen everything a middle school had to offer and had developed a comprehensive immunity to surprise. I told her I'd had a question about one of the students on my 7th period roster. She said, "Which one?" I said, "Theo Wainwright, Mrs." Farrow's expression did not change, but she stopped typing, which was notable because she'd been typing continuously since I'd walked in. She stopped and looked at me and said, "What about him?" I said, "He wasn't in class today, but his name is on the roster." I just wanted to flag it for attendance records. She said, "How long have you been subbing here?" I said, "I've covered Harwick twice before. Today was my 3rd time." She said, "Okay." She went back to typing. Then, without looking up, she said, "Theo Wainwright has been on the 7th period roster since the school year started. He's marked absent every day. He's been absent since September 4th. I said, "That's the first week of school." She said, "Yes." I said, "Has anyone followed up?" That's a lot of absences. She stopped typing again. This time she looked at me for a moment before she spoke. She said, "His family moved over the summer. The enrollment record wasn't updated before the rosters were generated. It's a clerical issue. We're aware of it." She said it in the tone of someone reciting a prepared explanation. The words were right. The delivery was slightly too smooth, the way an answer is smooth when it has been given many times. I said, "Do you know where they moved?" Long pause. She said, "I don't have that information." I said thank you and handed in my attendance sheet and badge and left. I came back to Harwick 3 weeks later. Different teacher out, different subject, 7th grade math, 1st floor west wing. I was not assigned to room 118. I didn't have 7th period, but I thought about Theo Wainwright on the drive in. I thought about the desk with no marks on it and the boy who hadn't blinked and Mrs. Farrow's prepared explanation. During my lunch break, I went to the library. School libraries have archives that don't get digitized. Old yearbooks, old newsletters, the physical record of a school's history that sits in labeled binders on shelves that nobody looks at. The librarian, a young man named Mr. Osai, who seemed pleased to have an adult in the library during lunch, pointed me toward the shelf without asking why I wanted it. I pulled yearbooks from the last 5 years and sat at a table in the back. I looked for Theo Wainwright. He wasn't in the most recent yearbook. That made sense if he'd only been enrolled for 4 days before the absence record started. But I looked anyway. Then I looked in the yearbook from 2 years ago. He would have been in 6th grade then, if he'd been at Harwick for more than 1 year. He was there. 6th grade class photo. I almost missed him because the photos were small and I was scanning quickly, but his name was in the caption. Theo Wainwright, 2nd row, far right. The boy in the photo had dark hair. He was looking at the camera with the particular slightly too serious expression that kids make when they are told to smile and don't quite manage it. He looked exactly like the boy I'd seen in room 118. I sat with the yearbook for a moment. Then I looked at the photo more carefully. Behind Theo Wainwright, in the back row, there was a small notation I'd almost skipped over. It wasn't in the caption. It was a tiny asterisk printed next to his name, the kind that usually indicates a footnote. I looked at the bottom of the page. The footnote said, "In memoriam." I went back to the front office. Mrs. Farrow was at her desk. She looked up when I came in, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, in the way of someone who had been expecting a visit they'd hoped wouldn't come. I put the yearbook on her desk, open to the 6th grade class photo. I said, "Can you tell me what happened to Theo Wainwright?" She looked at the photo for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you find that?" I said, "The library. It's a school yearbook. It's on a public shelf." She said, "I see." She closed the yearbook. She didn't give it back to me. She folded her hands on top of it, and she looked at me with the expression of someone making a decision. Then she said, "Theo Wainwright died in August, between 6th and 7th grade. It was an accident. He drowned at a lake near his family's cabin. He was 13 years old. His family didn't move." That was what we told staff who asked, because the principal decided it was better than the truth for administrative purposes. The roster wasn't corrected because the principal asked us not to correct it. I said, "Why?" She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Because Mr. Aldous asked her not to." I said, "The regular science teacher." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why would Mr. Aldous ask that?" Another pause. Longer this time. She said, "Because Theo Wainwright was one of his students. And because Mr. Aldous said, and I am telling you this because you found the yearbook and you're going to look into this regardless. So it's better you hear it from someone who was there, Mr. Aldous said that Theo was still coming to class." The room was very quiet. I said, "And you believed him?" She said, "I didn't at first. Then I covered his class one morning when he had a meeting. I took attendance, and I understood what he meant. I found Mr. Aldous's email in the staff directory and sent him a message that evening. I didn't know how to begin it, so I just described what I'd seen. The boy in the seat, the unblinking attention, the desk with no marks, the cold surface. I described it as neutrally as I could, the way you describe something when you're not sure the person on the other end is going to believe you. He replied within an hour. He wrote, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't warn you more directly." The note about underlining was the closest I could get to warning you without having to explain in writing what you might see. He wrote, "I've been teaching for 22 years. I have never had a student like Theo. Not because of what happened to him, because of who he was before. He was the kind of student you get once in a long career if you're lucky, genuinely curious, completely present. The kind of attention that makes you feel like the thing you're teaching actually matters. I only had him for 1 year. He died in August before his 2nd year with me." He wrote, "He showed up in my classroom on the first day of the new school year. September 4th. I want to be clear that I know what that sentence means, and I am telling you it anyway. I walked into room 118 at 3:15 for 7th period, and Theo Wainwright was sitting in his assigned seat, and he was watching the door. He was waiting." He wrote, "I didn't scream. I didn't run. I'm not sure why. Maybe because he looked exactly like himself, and I had spent a summer grieving him, and some part of me was simply glad to see him. I took attendance. I marked him present. I taught the class. He wrote he's been there every 7th period since. He doesn't speak, and he doesn't move except to watch whoever is at the front of the room. But he's there. I don't know what he wants. I don't know if he wants anything. I think he just liked the class. I think he liked learning. And I think something of that stayed. He wrote, I take his attendance every day. I mark him present. It's the only thing I know how to do for him. I read the email 3 times. Then I wrote back. I said, does it bother you? He replied, it did at first. Now it feels like what it is. A student who isn't finished yet. I teach to the whole room. I always have. I've covered Harwick 4 more times since then. Each time I've been assigned to other classrooms, other subjects, other periods. I haven't had 7th period science again. But I think about room 118. I think about Mr. Aldous walking in on September 4th and finding a student he'd spent the summer morning sitting in his assigned seat, waiting. I think about the decision he made in that moment, not to run, not to call someone, not to treat it as something to be resolved. Just to teach the class, to take attendance and mark him present and continue. There's something in that I find more affecting than I expected to. Not the presence itself, though I'll be honest, I haven't stopped thinking about the unblinking attention, about the cold desk, about the way the room went quiet around him. But the response to it. A teacher who lost a student and found him again in some form and chose to keep showing up. I looked up Theo Wainwright's obituary. It was in the local paper, 4 paragraphs. It said he was 13 years old, that he loved science and building models and a particular series of fantasy novels I'd never heard of. It said he was survived by his parents and a younger sister. It said he was remembered by his teachers as a student of exceptional curiosity and focus. Exceptional curiosity and focus. I thought about the way he'd watched me. That complete, unmoving attention. The quality I'd described as wrong, as something to be afraid of. Maybe I'd been describing the wrong thing. Maybe it was just what he'd always been like. A kid who really, genuinely paid attention. Who sat in a classroom and listened as if what was being taught actually mattered. Who showed up even after he had no reason to, because something in him wasn't done. I don't know if I believe in what I saw. I'm a substitute teacher. I believe in lesson plans and seating charts and getting through the period. I believe in the things I can measure and account for. But I also believe in the attendance record. And according to the attendance record of room 118, 7th period, Harwick Middle School, Theo Wainwright has not missed a single class. I need to start by telling you that I am not someone who believes in things. I want that on the record before anything else, because what I'm about to describe is the kind of thing that people dismiss based on the character of the person telling it. They think, was she the type? Was she impressionable, anxious, prone to seeing patterns that weren't there? I was 16 when this happened. I was a straight-A student, captain of the debate team, the kind of teenager who color-coded her notes and kept a calendar and did not believe in anything she couldn't verify. I am telling you this not to brag, but because it matters. What happened to me did not happen to someone who was looking for it. It happened at Kellner High School, in the guidance counselor's office, on a Wednesday afternoon in March of my junior year. I'll tell you about the office first. Kellner was a large public high school, about 2,000 students, the kind of building that had been added onto several times over the decades so that it had the slightly incoherent layout of something designed by committee. The main building was from the 1950s. There were 2 wings added in the 70s, another in the 90s. The guidance suite was in the oldest part of the building, a cluster of 4 offices off a waiting room that still had the linoleum flooring and drop ceiling tiles of the original construction. There were 4 counselors. Mine was Mr. Breck, late 40s, salt and pepper hair, the kind of steady, calm demeanor that made him good at his job. He'd been at Kellner for 12 years. He remembered students' names, remembered what they'd told him in sessions months ago, had the specific gift of making you feel like you were the only appointment on his calendar, even when you could see the stack of files on his desk. I liked him. I want to be clear about that. What I'm about to tell you is not a story about a bad counselor or a bad school. It's a story about a room. The 4th office in the guidance suite had been empty for as long as I'd been at Kellner. The door was always closed. The nameplate slot beside it was always blank. Sometimes when I was sitting in the waiting room, I'd look at that door and think about the last counselor who'd had that office, whether they'd moved or retired or simply left, and whether their files were still inside. In March of my junior year, I found out. I had an appointment with Mr. Breck on a Wednesday at 2:30. I'd been in to talk about college applications. I was starting to research early decision programs and wanted his perspective on timeline. It was a normal appointment, scheduled in advance, nothing unusual. I arrived at the guidance suite at 2:25. The waiting room had 2 other students in it, a senior I didn't know who was looking at his phone, and a sophomore girl I recognized from the debate team who gave me a small nod. I sat down in one of the chairs along the wall. At 2:30, Mr. Breck's door opened and he leaned out and said he was running about 10 minutes behind. Could I wait? I said, of course. He went back inside. The senior got called in to one of the other offices. The sophomore's appointment went ahead of her and she went in. By 2:40, the waiting room was empty except for me. I was reviewing my notes on early decision programs when the door to the 4th office opened. I looked up because a door opening is a sound you respond to automatically. The door was open maybe 6 inches. The interior of the office was dark, the overhead light was off, and the blinds were down. I couldn't see anything inside. I looked at the door for a moment. Then I looked back at my notes. 20 seconds later, I heard a voice say, "Come in." It came from the 4th office. Low, even, the neutral professional tone of a counselor beginning an appointment. Not an unusual voice. Not frightening. Just a voice saying 2 words in a room that was supposed to be empty. I sat very still. The voice said, "Rachel, come in." It knew my name. I want to tell you I got up and left. I want to tell you that the correct response is always to leave, and I took it. But I didn't. And I've spent a long time trying to understand why, because I think the why is important. It wasn't that I wasn't afraid. I was. The moment it said my name, my heart rate went up in the particular way it goes up when something is wrong. Not the adrenaline spike of a sudden shock, but the slower, deeper dread of a situation that doesn't make sense and doesn't have an obvious exit. But the voice was so ordinary. That's the thing I keep coming back to. It was a counselor's voice. Measured, calm, the specific warmth of someone trained to make you feel heard. And some part of my brain, the part that had spent 3 years in that building being told to trust the adults in positions of authority, heard a calm professional voice saying my name and reached for a normal explanation before it could stop itself. Maybe there was a new counselor. Maybe someone had been assigned to that office and I hadn't noticed. Maybe I'd been scheduled with the wrong person and this was correcting that error. I stood up. I crossed the waiting room. I pushed the door open. The office was small and dim, the only light coming from the edges of the closed blinds. There was a desk, a chair behind it, 2 chairs in front of it. The walls had the standard guidance office decorations, a poster with a quote about potential, a bulletin board, a bookshelf with binders and reference books. Behind the desk, there was a person. I couldn't see them clearly in the low light. What I could see, a figure in a chair, the shape of a person sitting in the posture of someone at work, leaning slightly forward, hands on the desk. The hands were the most visible thing, pale, folded on the desk surface, very still. The figure said, "Sit down, Rachel. We should talk about your plans." I sat down in one of the chairs in front of the desk. I did it automatically, the way you sit down when an adult in a position of authority tells you to sit. I sat down before I could stop myself, and then I was sitting in a chair 2 feet away from a desk in a dark office that should have been empty, and the door swung shut behind me. I'm going to tell you what I remember from the next few minutes, and I want to be honest that my memory of it is not clean. Experiences that are wrong in the way this was wrong do something to memory. They don't erase it. They make it granular, fractured, the way a photograph loses resolution when you zoom in too far. The figure spoke. The voice was the same, neutral professional warmth as before. It asked me about my plans, what I was thinking for college, what I wanted to study, where I saw myself in 5 years. Standard counseling questions. The questions a guidance counselor asks a junior in March. I answered them. I'm almost certain I answered them. I have a memory of speaking, of hearing my own voice give responses that sounded reasonable, though I can't reconstruct exactly what I said. What I remember clearly is this. At some point during the conversation, I adjusted to the low light enough to see the figure more clearly. And I looked at their face. I can't describe it. I want to be precise, and I cannot be precise about this specific thing. I've tried many times. I've sat down with the intention of writing out a detailed description, and each time I reach that moment, the words don't come. Not because I don't remember. Because the thing I remember doesn't translate into description the way a face does. A face has features you can name. What was behind that desk had the arrangement of a face without the features. The shape of a person without the substance. I looked at it and I understood at a level below conscious thought that I was in a room with something that was not a person. And then the door opened behind me and Mr. Breck said, "Rachel, I'm ready for you." I turned around. Mr. Breck was standing in the doorway, his expression moving quickly from neutral to concerned as he looked at me. He said, "What are you doing in here?" I turned back to the desk. The chair was empty. The desk was bare. The room was just a room. Mr. Breck closed the 4th office door and walked me to his own office and sat me down and got me a glass of water. He was calm and professional about it, the way he was calm and professional about everything, but I could see in the set of his expression that he was not entirely surprised. I told him what had happened. The voice, my name, the figure behind the desk, the questions about my plans. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long do you think you were in there?" I said, "Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe less." He said, "Okay," and looked at the wall. I said, "Whose office is that?" He said, "It's been unoccupied for several years." I said, "Several years is vague. How many?" He said, "Since I've been here. 12 years. It was unoccupied when I arrived." I said, Was there a counselor there before that? He picked up a pen and set it down again. He said, "The school's been here since 1954. I don't know the full history of every office. What I know is that when I started, that door was closed, and the office director at the time told me it was storage and not to worry about it. I said, but it's not storage. I was just in it. It's set up like an office. It has a desk and chairs and a bookshelf." Long pause. He said, "I know." I said, "You've been in it." He said, "Once. My first year. I heard something, a voice, from behind the door. I opened it. There was no one there. I went in to check, and I saw the desk and the chairs and he stopped. He said, I left. I closed the door. I haven't opened it since." I said, "It said my name." "How did it know my name?" He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I think it knows all of them." I did what I always do when I need to understand something. I researched it. Kellner High School's history wasn't hard to find. The local historical society had records going back to the original construction in 1954, and the school itself had a display case in the main hallway with photographs and documents marking significant milestones. I spent 2 lunch periods and 1 free period going through what I could access. The guidance department at Kellner had been established in 1961 when the school added its first dedicated counseling staff. The original suite had 4 offices, the same 4 that existed now. I found a photograph from 1963 showing the guidance staff, 4 people, 3 men and a woman, posed in front of the office doors. The nameplate on the 4th office read, Voss, counselor. I found Voss in 2 other photographs from the 60s, both faculty group shots. A man, perhaps 40 in the earlier photo, perhaps 50 in the later one. Thin, with the kind of formal posture that people had in photographs of that era. In the later photograph, the one from what I estimated to be 1969 or 1970, he was not smiling. The other faculty members were. He was looking at the camera with an expression I couldn't fully read. I found a brief mention of him in the school's 1971 newsletter, archived in the Historical Society's collection. The newsletter announced, in a single short paragraph, that Voss had left his position at Kellner at the end of the previous school year after 15 years of service. It thanked him for his contributions and wished him well. No further details. And then, in a box of miscellaneous documents from the 70s that the Historical Society had never fully catalogued, I found a letter. It was from a parent, addressed to the school principal, dated November 1970. The parent's name was redacted. Someone had gone over it with black marker, presumably to protect privacy, but the content was legible. The parent wrote that their daughter had missed an appointment with a regular counselor and had somehow ended up in a session with Mr. Voss instead. The daughter had come home from school that day, the parent's words altered. Quiet in a way she hadn't been before. Unable to describe clearly what had been discussed in the session, only that Mr. Voss had asked her about her plans and that she'd answered his questions. The parent wrote that their daughter had not recovered her usual disposition for several weeks afterward. They were writing to request that Mr. Voss not be permitted to conduct unsupervised sessions with students. At the bottom of the letter, in different handwriting, presumably the principal's, was a single line, matter under review. Voss left Kellner at the end of that school year. His office had been closed ever since. I brought everything I'd found to Mr. Breck. The photographs, the newsletter, the letter. I spread them on his desk, and I told him what I'd pieced together. He looked at the materials for a long time. Then he said, "The question I keep getting stuck on is what he wanted. 50 years of sitting in a dark office, asking students about their plans. What was he getting from that?" I said, "Maybe nothing. Maybe it's just what he did. What he knew how to do, Mr." Breck said, "That's more unsettling in a way." I said, "I know." I said, "The girl in 1970, the letter says she came home altered. Quiet in a way she hadn't been before. I've been trying to figure out if I feel that. If something is different, Mr." Breck looked at me carefully. He said, "Do you?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. The way I try to think about things, honestly, without deciding the answer before I'd actually looked for it. I said, "I don't think so. I think I got out fast enough. I think when you opened the door it interrupted something." He said, "I'm glad I came when I did." I said, "Me too." He looked at the photographs again. Then he said, "I'm going to talk to the principal about getting that office properly sealed. Not just closed, sealed. I should have done it 11 years ago." I said, "Do you think it'll help?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it's the right thing to do regardless, even if it doesn't help." That was 4 years ago. I'm in college now, junior year, studying psychology, which I recognize is exactly the kind of thing you'd expect someone to study after an experience like that, and which I promise had more to do with my interest in how people make decisions than with anything that happened at Kellner High School. I looked up Mr. Breck last year. He's still at Kellner. I found his name in a staff directory online. I thought about emailing him, but I wasn't sure what I'd say. I think about reaching out sometimes, and then I don't. The thing that stays with me most is not the figure behind the desk. It's not the face I can't describe. It's the questions. What are your plans? What do you want to study? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Standard counseling questions. The questions that map the shape of a future. The questions you ask when you want to know where someone is going. I've thought a lot about why those would be the questions. Why, if something was sitting in that office for 50 years, calling students in one by one, those would be the questions it chose. The best answer I've come to is this: futures are a kind of energy. The particular density of a 17-year-old's sense of possibility, the plans that haven't failed yet, the paths that are still open, the feeling that the shape of your life is not yet determined. There's something in that specific moment, that specific age, that doesn't exist anywhere else. And I think, whatever are, Voss became, after he stopped being a person, learned to feed on it. I don't know if that's true. I'm a psychology major, not a theologian, and I don't have a framework for what I'm describing. But it's the answer that fits the evidence the way good answers fit evidence. It explains the thing without leaving loose ends. An old counselor who never left his office. Still asking the same questions. Still listening to the answers. For 50 years, one student at a time. The darkroom at Valancourt High School had been there since 1971. I know this because there was a plaque on the wall above the chemical trays, a small brass rectangle that said, "Donated in memory of Arthur Crew, photography instructor, 1944-1971. The dates meant he died the year the room was built. I always assumed the room was the memorial, that they'd built it in his honor, the way schools name gymnasiums after coaches and libraries after principals. I didn't find out until much later that I had it exactly backward. The room wasn't built in his memory. The plaque was put there because of what the room had already been doing for 20 years before anyone thought to explain it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Joel Asher. In the fall of 2009, I was a junior at Valancourt, 17 years old, and I had just joined the school newspaper as staff photographer. I'd been shooting since I was 14, nothing serious. A second-hand Canon my aunt had given me, weekends wandering around taking pictures of things I thought looked interesting. I'd gotten decent at it, the way you get decent at things you do constantly and care about. When I saw the newspaper listing in the activities fair, I signed up without thinking twice. The faculty advisor was a woman named Miss Tarrant, who taught English and had been running the paper for 9 years. She was one of those teachers who was genuinely enthusiastic about the work, not performed enthusiasm, the real kind that makes you feel like what you're doing matters. She showed me around the newspaper's workspace on the second floor, introduced me to the editors, and then said, "Let me show you the darkroom." The darkroom was in the basement. A separate room down a half-flight of stairs off the main corridor, with a heavy door and a light trap entry, a small vestibule between two doors so you could enter without flooding the room with light. Miss Tarrant showed me the equipment, the enlarger, the developing tanks, the chemical trays in their red safe-light glow. She showed me where the paper was stored and how the ventilation system worked and which chemicals went in which order. Then she said, "One more thing. When you're developing prints, you're going to see things in the tray that surprise you. Things you didn't photograph. Don't be alarmed. It's a quirk of the room. Old rooms develop quirks. Just finish your work and leave the prints on the drying rack and don't take them home. Okay." I said, "What kind of things?" She said, "You'll see. It's easier to explain after." She left me to explore the equipment on my own. I spent an hour down there that afternoon getting familiar with the enlarger and the trays, running a test roll of film through the development process to see if I remembered the steps correctly. I did. I didn't see anything unusual that day. That came 3 weeks later. My first real assignment for the paper was the fall sports coverage, soccer and cross-country, home games, shoot them, and get prints to the layout editor by Thursday. Standard stuff. I shot 2 soccer games and a cross-country meet over the course of a week, burned through 4 rolls of film, and brought them to the darkroom on a Wednesday evening after school. The darkroom was empty when I arrived. It usually was in the evenings. Most of the other newspaper photographers were seniors who'd been doing this for 2 years and had developed efficient habits, in and out in under an hour during lunch or free periods. The evening slot was available, and I preferred it. Fewer people, more time, no pressure. I developed the film first, 4 rolls in the tank, which took about 40 minutes of chemistry and washing and hanging to dry. Then I set up the enlarger and started making contact sheets, a full print of every frame on a roll small to help you decide which images were worth enlarging. I was on my second roll's contact sheet when I noticed the first one. Contact sheets go into the developer tray and you watch the image emerge. It comes up slowly, like something rising through water, the dark areas first, and then the midtones, and then the highlights last. It's one of the things I loved about film photography even then, the slow materialization of an image, the way it felt like watching a memory become real. The contact sheet from roll 2 emerged normally for about 15 seconds. Then, in the upper left corner, in a frame I knew had been a wide shot of the soccer field, I saw something that wasn't the soccer field. It was a hallway. Not a hallway I recognized immediately. The image was small, contact sheet scale, maybe 1.5 inches across. But it was clearly a hallway, the linear perspective of a long corridor, lockers on both sides, the overhead lights in a row. And standing at the far end of the hallway, too small to make out clearly, a figure. I pulled the sheet out of the developer and into the stop bath and fixer, and wash without thinking, the process automatic. Then I held it up under the safe light and looked at that frame. My handwriting was on the roll leader. Roll 2, soccer game 2, Oct 4. I had shot that entire roll at the soccer game. I had not photographed a hallway. I put the contact sheet on the drying rack. I finished the other 2 rolls. I went home. I didn't sleep very well that night. The next day I found Miss Tarrant during her free period and told her what I'd seen. I described it precisely: the frame, the hallway, the figure at the end. I told her the roll had been shot at the soccer game, and I had no explanation for an image of a school hallway appearing on it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Did you leave the prints on the drying rack?" I said yes. She said, "Good. Don't take them home." I know I said that already, but I want to say it again. I said, "What is it?" She sat back. She had the expression of someone deciding how much to tell a person who has clearly already seen enough that they deserve the full version. She said, "The darkroom has been doing this since before I came to Valancourt. Since before the teacher before me came to Valancourt. As far as I can trace it, it started sometime in the late 70s. Film developed in that room sometimes produces images that weren't on the original negative. They show up on prints, not on the negatives themselves, I've checked. The negatives are clean. The prints are where they appear." I said, "That's not how photography works." She said, "I know." I said, "What do the images show?" She said, "Usually hallways. Sometimes classrooms. Occasionally the exterior of the building, but from angles that don't match any position you could stand in outside. And there's almost always a figure. Sometimes close, sometimes far away. Always the same figure, as far as I can tell, though it's never clear enough to identify." She said, "The important things are 2. First, the images are only on prints developed in that room. If you take your negatives to an outside lab, this doesn't happen. Second, and I want you to take this seriously, the prints should stay in the room. The ones that have the extra images. Don't take them home, don't give them to anyone, don't show them around. Leave them on the rack, and I'll handle them." I said, "What do you do with them?" She paused. She said, "I keep them." I did what anyone in my position would have done. I kept developing in the darkroom. I kept leaving the anomalous prints on the rack, and I spent every free moment I had trying to figure out what was happening. I started with the plaque. Arthur Crew, photography instructor, 1944-1971. The years worked out to 27 years at the school, which was a long career. He died the year the darkroom was built, which meant he taught photography without a dedicated darkroom for most of his tenure. The school's archives had yearbooks going back to 1952, and I found Arthur Crew in all of them. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, photographed in faculty group shots, always at the edge of the frame, always with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who preferred to be behind the camera rather than in front of it. In the 1965 yearbook, I found something else. A full page dedicated to the photography club, with a photograph of the club members and their work displayed on a corkboard behind them. The work on the corkboard was too small to read in detail, but one image caught my eye, a print pinned to the upper right corner of the board, larger than the others, showing a long hallway with lockers on both sides. I took the yearbook to the library's microfiche reader and enlarged the page as much as the machine would allow. The print on the board showed a hallway. At the far end of the hallway, small but visible, a figure. Arthur Crew had been photographing this hallway in 1965. 6 years before the darkroom was built. 6 years before he died. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went back to the yearbooks and looked more carefully at every photography club page I could find, every image that showed student work. The hallway appeared 4 more times across 5 yearbooks, always in the background, always on a print that someone had pinned to a board or left on a desk. Always with the figure. He'd been seeing it for decades before the darkroom existed. The darkroom hadn't created the anomaly. He had brought it with him. And when he died, it had stayed. I want to tell you about the night I stayed too late. It was a Friday in November, 3 weeks after I'd talked to Miss Tarrant. I had a full role to develop and print, the homecoming game, which I'd shot in the fading light of a late October afternoon, and which I was worried hadn't come out because the exposure had been tricky. I wanted to see the contact sheets before the weekend, so I knew whether I needed to reshoot anything. I signed into the building at 4:30 and went to the darkroom. I developed the film, made the contact sheets, and was relieved to see the exposures had worked. I started making enlargements of the best frames. Enlarging takes longer than contact sheets. You're selecting specific frames, composing them in the enlarger, making test strips to calibrate the exposure, then doing final prints and developing them one at a time. It's methodical and absorbing, and I lost track of time. When I came out of the darkroom, it was 6:50. The building was supposed to close at 6. The corridor outside the darkroom was dim. The main lights had been switched off, which the custodial staff did on a circuit when they cleared each section of the building. The emergency lighting was on, the low amber glow of the exit signs and the occasional wall-mounted emergency light. Enough to see by, not enough to feel comfortable. I had my bag and my jacket. I needed to get to the main exit, up the half-flight of stairs from the basement corridor, and then left through the main hall to the front doors. 2 minutes, maybe less. I was halfway up the stairs when I saw the figure at the end of the main corridor. The main corridor at Valancourt was long, maybe 150 feet from the stairwell to the front doors. In the emergency lighting, it was amber and shadowed, the lockers on both sides reduced to dark shapes. And at the far end, standing in front of the main doors, there was a person. I stopped on the stairs. The figure was motionless, standing facing me or facing in my direction. At 150 feet in low light, I couldn't read the details. The right height for a person, the right general shape. Standing very still. I thought custodian. Teacher who stayed late. Security guard doing rounds. There were any number of reasons for a person to be standing at the end of a school corridor at 6:50 on a Friday evening. I said hello. The figure didn't move. I said, sorry, I know I'm late. I was in the darkroom and lost track of time. Nothing. I started walking toward the exit. Toward the figure. Because the exit was in that direction, and there was no other way out of this corridor, and I was going toward it with my head up and my pace steady, because I was 17 years old, and I was not going to stand frozen on a staircase in an empty school. I walked. At 100 feet, the figure was still there. At 75 feet, I could see more clearly that it was not moving at all. Not the small shifts of weight that a standing person makes, not the slight movement of breathing. Completely still in the way that people are not still, unless they are working very hard at it or they are something other than a person. At 50 feet, the emergency light above the main doors flickered. In the half-second of darkness that followed, I kept walking because I had committed to walking, and stopping felt worse. When the light steadied, the corridor was empty. I walked the remaining 50 feet to the front doors, pushed them open, and stood on the front steps of Valancourt High School in the cold November air and breathed. Behind me, through the glass doors, the corridor was empty all the way to the stairwell. I went home. The next week, I went back to Miss Tarrant. I told her about the corridor. I told her what I'd seen and where, and how close I'd gotten before the light flickered. She was quiet for longer than usual. Then she said, "How close was 50 feet?" I said, "Close enough to see that it wasn't moving. Not breathing movement close, but close." She said, "That's closer than it usually gets." I said, "Usually." She said, "The figure in the prints has been getting closer over the years. In the oldest prints I have, from the 80s, the ones the previous advisor left me, it's at the far end of the hallway. Small. In the prints from the last few years, it's maybe halfway down. In this year's prints, it's been consistently at the 2/3 mark." She said it the way you describe a data trend. Calm, factual, like she was presenting findings rather than telling me that something was getting closer. I said, "Closer to what?" She said, "I don't know. The exit, maybe. The edge of the frame." I said, "And you've been tracking this for how long?" She said, 9 years. Since I took over the paper. I said, "And the advisor before you?" She said, "She tracked it for 11 years. She left me her files when she retired. I have prints going back to 1983. I said, 26 years of prints showing a figure getting closer to the edge of the frame. She said, "Yes." I said, "And nobody has done anything about it." She said, "What would you do?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't entirely. But I was 17, and I had the particular stubbornness of someone who believes that problems are meant to be solved, and so I said, "I want to see the files." She looked at me for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a key. The files were in a cabinet in the newspaper storage room, 3 drawers of them, organized by year. Each year had an envelope. Each envelope contained the anomalous prints from that year's darkroom sessions, the ones Miss Tarrant and her predecessor had pulled from the drying rack and kept. I spread them on the layout table in chronological order. The oldest prints were from 1983. They were yellowed at the edges, the contrast slightly off in the way of prints that have aged without proper storage. But the images were clear enough. A school hallway, lockers on both sides, overhead lights. And at the far end, very small, a dark shape that might have been a person. I worked forward through the years. 1985, the figure slightly larger. Still at the far end, but more defined. The outline of a person rather than a shape. 1989, closer. Maybe 2/3 of the way down the hallway. Tall, thin, dressed in what appeared to be dark clothing. No facial features visible at this distance. 1994, halfway. The figure was now large enough that I could see it was a man. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a jacket. Head slightly bowed. 1999, a third of the way down. Close enough now that I could see his hands were at his sides, and he was holding something in his right hand. Something rectangular. A book, maybe, or a box. 2004, closer still. I could see that his head was not bowed, but tilted, the particular angle of someone looking through a viewfinder. He was holding a camera. I sat with that print for a long time. Arthur Crew, photography instructor. The man who had photographed this hallway for decades before the darkroom existed, who had developed in the darkroom for 1 year before he died, who had left something behind in that room that had been producing images ever since. He wasn't haunting the room. He was still working in it. And after 38 years of slow transit down that hallway, he was getting close enough that you could see what he was carrying. I looked at the most recent prints from the current year from my own sessions. In the prints from October, he was a quarter of the way from the near end of the hallway. close enough that I could see the wire-rimmed glasses. In the print from 2 weeks ago, he was close enough that I could see his face. It was the face from the yearbook photographs. Thin, wire-rimmed glasses, the expression of someone who preferred to be behind the camera. He was looking directly at the lens. I printed the yearbook photograph. The 1965 faculty group shot, Arthur Crew at the edge of the frame. I brought it to the darkroom, and I pinned it to the wall above the chemical trays, next to the plaque. I don't know exactly why I did it. It felt like the right thing, the same instinct that makes you acknowledge someone you recognize in a hallway, even if you don't know them well. He'd been working in this room, in whatever way he was still working, for 38 years. He deserved to be acknowledged, Miss. Tarrant found it the next morning and didn't take it down. She looked at it for a while, and then she looked at me, and she said, he had a particular way of developing prints. The previous advisor documented it. She found old notes in the supply cabinet in his handwriting. Specific temperatures, specific timing, a particular sequence for the stop bath. Different from the standard process. She said, I've been following his process for 9 years. I taught it to the students. I don't know if it matters, but it seemed like the right thing to do. I said, you've been developing his way this whole time. She said, someone kept the room going the way he'd set it up. I figured there was a reason. I thought about that. A room maintained in the specific configuration of the person who'd used it last. A process kept alive through one advisor, and then another, passed down not as a tradition, but as a practical instruction set, not fully understood but faithfully followed. A darkroom that had been running the way Arthur Crew ran it since 1971. I said, do you think he knows we're here? She said, I think that photograph on the wall is getting closer every year. I think something is happening. I don't know if knows is the right word for it. I said, what do you think happens when he reaches the end of the hallway? She looked at the plaque for a moment. Then she said, I've been trying not to think about that. I graduated from Valancourt in the spring of 2011. I kept shooting, kept developing my own film, but I never found another darkroom that did what the Valancourt darkroom did. My prints came out clean everywhere else. Whatever it was specific to that room. I stayed in touch with Miss Tarrant. Not regularly, an email every few months, checking in. She stayed at Valancourt for 3 more years after I graduated, and then moved to a different school. Before she left, she sent me a scan of the last anomalous print from her final year. I opened the attachment, and I sat with it for a long time. The hallway was almost completely foreshortened, the perspective compressed, the far end barely visible. Arthur Crew was close. Very close. Close enough that I could see the camera clearly. A medium format film camera, the kind used for professional work in the 1960s, held at chest height. He was in focus. In every previous print, he had been slightly soft, the figure in the middle distance, rendered with the ambient blur of something that wasn't quite in the plane of focus. In this print, he was sharp. Every detail clear. The glasses, the jacket, the particular tilt of his head as he looked through the viewfinder. He was photographing something at the near end of the hallway. Something just outside the frame. I zoomed into the image on my screen and looked at where he was pointing the camera. He was pointing it at the viewer. He was pointing it at whoever was standing at the enlarger, looking at the print in the tray. He had been walking toward the person developing his film for 38 years, and when he finally got close enough, he raised his camera and took their picture. I don't know what Miss Tarrant's replacement found when she took over the darkroom. I don't know if the print started a new sequence. The figure back at the far end of the hallway beginning the long walk again. I don't know if it ended. I don't know if ending is even the right concept for whatever was happening in that room. What I know is that Arthur Crewe spent 27 years photographing Valancourt High School. He photographed its students and its hallways and its events, and when he died, he left his process and his equipment and something else behind in the room that had been built in his name. And for 38 years after his death, one print at a time, developed in the chemicals the way he'd taught, he worked his way down the hallway toward whoever was on the other side of the lens. A photographer who never stopped shooting, who just needed to get close enough.